Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I am very excited to be talking with you all about good nutrition for your picky eater. And so let's get started. Let's see here. Okay, so today what I'm going to be spending time talking about is, first of all, I want to cover why does good nutrition even matter. So we'll talk about that real brief. And then I'm going to talk about, well, what is good nutrition? And then I'll spend a lot of time really get into talking about picky eaters versus problem eaters, and then strategies, how to address feeding your picky eater or problem eater with good nutrition and nutrient-dense foods. And then we're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about healthy weight for a picky eater, because sometimes picky eaters are not underweight. They might be normal weight or overweight. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that as well. Okay, so why does good nutrition matter? Well, just in general, a lifetime of health is related to nutrition. So a lot of times we think about disease prevention, like preventing heart disease or high blood pressure, diabetes. But kids and teens probably identify more with these reasons. Good mood is affected by the foods that we choose for kids and adults. Energy and focus is definitely affected by the foods that kids and teens are eating. Healthy skin and hair, kids can relate to that a little bit better than future disease prevention. Strong bones and muscles. And another thing that kids will identify with also is just feeling better on the inside, meaning how does their tummy feel, gut health, how are they tolerating the foods that they're eating. So this is why good nutrition matters for kids. It really does play a big part in overall well-being for adults and kids for sure. So a little bit about what is good nutrition, and I'm going to be talking about this all throughout the webinar. But in general, these are the guidelines that I like to keep in mind when I'm thinking about or teaching about what is good nutrition. So, eating lots of good whole grains, lots of fruits and veggies, making wise dietary fat choices, meaning, the healthier fats versus deep-fried fat foods. Getting calcium-rich foods is important, and also lean proteins. And then knowing the limits on salt and sugars. So in general, this is just really what I think of when we talk about good nutrition. Here's a balanced plate, what I like to share with people. And what we have here is it shows a balance of foods. So we've got some good carbohydrate choices. So that's your dairy and healthy whole grains. That's a potato up there in the left-hand corner. And then fruits. So those are carbohydrate foods, and the more whole grain carbohydrates that you can choose, as I mentioned in the last slide, is going to be better nutrition-wise overall. But the other great thing about this balanced plate is that there's a good portion of vegetables on the plate, which serves as a fiber source, lots of good nutrients in there. And so if, thinking about visually to offer some kind of vegetable at each meal. And then also there's a protein in this balanced plate. So when I'm talking about balance, because I will mention that in some of these slides moving forward, this is what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about some healthy carbohydrates, some lean proteins, some good nutrition from fruits and vegetables, and all of that really can make a person feel better and just have overall general health when we're thinking about balance. But I want to get into specifics about nutrition for kids and teens, because there are some things that I focus in on more when I'm thinking about kids. So yes, encouraging overall balanced diet like we just talked about briefly, but also for kids, limiting sugar consumption, because a lot of kids are drawn to sugary foods, and a lot of good marketing out there that really markets some of those high sugar foods to kids. So that's a concern to keep an eye on, is limiting the sugar, and also trying to grocery shop for more fresh over processed foods. Calcium and iron, those are two nutrients that are really important for kids, and I'll get into more detail about those foods later on. And then just general nutrition for a healthy weight, and I've got some slides about that. Also, when I think about kids and teens, I really want to make sure that we're discouraging restrictive dieting and negative body image. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward as well. So let's talk a little bit about picky eater versus problem eater. So when I think about a picky eater, I'm thinking about kids or teens that eat fewer than 30 foods, compared with a problem eater that maybe they're limiting even further. They're limiting to maybe 20 foods, and then over time that list of foods is even shrinking more. When we think about texture, when we compare picky eaters versus problem eaters, a picky eater will at least eat one food maybe from each type of food texture, where sometimes a problem eater will refuse entire food groups with certain textures, for example. Maybe they don't like a crunch, or maybe they don't like anything that's pureed or mushy, for example. With a picky eater, they may eat many of the same favorite foods. With a problem eater, a favorite food will be eaten continually, but then they'll burn out of that favorite food. A picky eater will tolerate a new food sitting on their plate. They may even touch it or take a taste, but a problem eater won't even tolerate a new food near them, may even have a tantrum when it's in the vicinity. A picky eater may eat after exposure to a food 10 times, where a problem eater will not be influenced by exposure. A problem eater may be very inflexible with brands, maybe certain type of chicken nugget, for example, or only certain brands that they'll tolerate. So when we think about picky eaters, picky eater protocol, these are some different suggestions that and strategies that might help a picky eater, and also can help a problem eater too, but I'll go into some additional things when we're talking about a problem eater. So with picky eaters, routine for meal times and snacks can be very helpful for this person, so we can create some hunger. And then also continuing to offer the important basics, kind of when we think back at that balanced plate a couple slides back, when you're visually putting something together for that picky eater, think about the balance. Also limiting juice and pop for those picky eaters, because that's a source of empty calories that can really fill them up and leave them not hungry. And also, if the diet is loaded on sugar and not very balanced out, it can actually decrease their appetites a little bit, where they may not be desiring a balanced meal if they're really loading up on a lot of juice and pop. Limiting snacks to 2 to 3 times a day, and limiting the grazing. And we'll talk a little bit more about healthy snacks and nutrient snacks a little bit down the line. But making sure that they're hungry at certain times is going to be helpful. Choosing and grocery shopping for nutrient-dense foods. So what I mean by that would be, foods that have your grocery shopping so that there's going to be some protein on that label, or some added vitamins or minerals, or iron fortified, for example. And I'll show you a label coming up here in a little bit as well. The other thing is creating a pleasant mealtime environment so that you can avoid control issues. Because with kids and teens, you really can't win. We can't put food into their mouths when they're babies, of course, yes. But as they get older, they win. I mean, they shut their mouth when they don't want something in there. They refuse, and you can't really win when you're trying to control food. So trying to make that environment real pleasant is going to be important. So keeping meal times happy, these are just some ideas here that may be helpful. Having them come to the table hungry. Maybe if they're hungry before dinner is ready to be set on the table, or lunch is set on the table, maybe there's some veggie snacks out. If kids are really hungry, they may be more apt to try foods that they're not in love with, but eventually could fall in love with because they get used to them. So I'll always have snacks on my island while we're waiting for dinner, just because maybe they will try a bite here and there while they're so hungry, and they're very low calorie, so they're not going to ruin their dinner. They can still come to the table hungry after having a couple of veggies. Let's see. Okay, so the 3 components to each meal to visually think about is some protein food, some carb food, preferably whole grain carb, and then some fruit or vegetable. 3 components to each meal. And again, like I had mentioned before, it may take 10 or more introductions to a new food before your child will touch or even taste it, and that's okay. Another idea is to consider foods that puree well. There's a book that I really like. It's called The Sneaky Chef, and it's by Missy Chase Lapine, Lapine. And it's a book where she gives a lot of strategies to hide foods in different kinds of foods. So, for example, she has recipes and ideas of how to hide things like white beans, pureeing that and adding that to a food where it gives automatic protein and fiber, incorporating plain yogurt into different foods for the more calcium and protein. Ricotta cheese is a really easy food to hide. Avocado, sweet potatoes, tofu, those are just some examples, but she has a full book on how to hide things, healthy things into foods that your kids will eat. So it's just a way to really make foods nutrient dense and to sneak in some extra nutrition for those kids and teens that just aren't getting a good variety. Another way to keep mealtimes happy is to just be a good role model. You know, if your kids and teens see you tasting things and see you trying a variety or eating, a little bit of a variety at each plate. The one bite rule, so that is an idea that can work for some families. It's a real personal thing where, decide if that could be something that could be right for your family, if, offering that kids try at least a bite of something that's on their plate. Sometimes that's not always a good suggestion. It might create more of a control thing, but for some families, that's a good rule that has worked in the past. So depending on what age that your kids are, there are different things that they can do while you're prepping a meal that can really get them involved. And I think that as kids are more involved in meal planning, grocery shopping, talking about nutrition, looking at labels together with you, the more they're going to be apt to try things. So these are just some ideas to get kids involved, again, depending on the ages of it. But you can have young kids walking around with an order pad while you're busy getting dinner or lunch ready. You can have kids participate in mixing or stirring or chopping. That way, maybe if they don't feel like taking a taste of certain foods, at least they're getting familiar with being in the kitchen with them and preparing them with you. Setting the table, washing the table, it's a way to get them involved. Looking at labels, comparing different boxes of cereals is a nice way to get kids learning about balance. And I don't have kids look at boxes or labels for calories or fats or any of those, but I do have them look at labels for balance so that they begin to learn the importance of balance. And so what balance means, again, is some protein on the label, maybe some fiber, some nutrients, and I have a label coming up here that I'll show you what I mean more specifically. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about problem eaters. The way that you're going to help kids who you think might be more of a problem eater versus a picky eater would be some of the strategies mentioned already for picky eaters, but also in addition, you're going to want to determine the cause because a lot of times there might be a medical issue happening that is causing a kid not to like very many foods. For example, a kid may have some reflux or some, an inflamed esophagus. They may be having some diarrhea or constipation, nausea. There might be some medication side effects that are decreasing their appetite. Maybe they have some tooth issues or some pain. Another thing that's not listed here is sometimes kids with anxiety may not like eating in front of people. Social anxiety, for example, may have a kiddo that just is very uncomfortable eating in front of people. And so allowing some of, an adjustment for that so they can get the nutrition in that they need maybe in between meals a little bit. Another thing that can cause some uncomfortable feelings in their stomach, for example, could be if they have food intolerances or allergies where they just don't feel good when they eat certain things, and so they start to associate food in general with not feeling good. So determining if there is a medical cause is going to be really important for these problem eater kids or, even some highly picky eaters. You might want to definitely consult with a specialist. Other causes that can cause real problem eating might be if the child or teen is not swallowing very well. That can make them feel like they're not wanting to eat food in general. Environmental factors can play in. A lot of distractions will have kids not finishing their meals or grazing throughout the day so that they're not hungry can be a factor. Lack of routine. If meal times are stressful, which they can be sometimes when, as parents or mentors, we want kids to eat healthy. And so if there's too much focus or talk around food at mealtime, that can be very stressful for a kid as well. Is the chair too high? Is it too low? Are their utensils difficult for them to manage? So there are some different things there that could be looked at. Are there some behavioral issues? Maybe there's some parenting, controlling kinds of issues too, where they're trying to put their foot down and say, I don't want this, I don't want to eat this, where they're looking for some places for some control. And that's where giving choices can be helpful. Do you want this vegetable or this vegetable? And then they can feel like they're able to have a choice. So when to consider a team of specialists, I'm going to talk about that in a minute or so, but specialists could include your pediatrician, a registered dietitian, an occupational therapist or a speech therapist if there's behavioral or swallowing issues. You may, with picky eaters or problem eaters, want to consider a multivitamin, so talking to your doctor to rule out any nutrition deficiencies, because some symptoms of nutrition deficiencies may include a low appetite. Like I said, some medications can interfere with some nutrition and can interfere with an appetite as well. So just talking to your doctor about some specific nutrients might be important. If you do a multivitamin, for example, choosing a high-quality brand is going to be important. Some things to look for on that label would be a USP label or an NSF label, or consumerlabs.com is a website that I use where they look at all sorts of different brands and give them ratings, and they put a Consumer Lab seal of approval on supplements. So that's just a brief discussion about supplements there. But a lot of times if you have a picky eater or a problem eater, consulting with a dietitian can be super helpful. I think when it's really important to seek out help from your physician or dietitian, when it's really important to seek out help is if you're noticing weight loss, they're just not growing, if there's some attention, focus kinds of things, irritability, mood issues, anxiety, sleep disturbances, if they're just getting sick more often, or boy, if this continued appetite just continues to decline, reaching out to a team is going to be helpful, because individually looking at each kiddo is going to be what's important, especially when we're talking about nutrients and nutrition and covering all the bases there. So one thing to keep in mind is that, parents are responsible for what foods are offered, when foods are offered, and where. What are you grocery shopping for? What do you have on hand? But ultimately, kids are really responsible for their own food that they put in their mouth and how much they eat of it. We really can't win on that piece. So, setting up your kitchen so that you've got the stuff there to provide, it's available to them, but ultimately they do make the choice. And you can set up your kitchen to provide nutrient-dense foods. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit more the second half of the webinar. In general, we want to do moderation of the less healthy foods. We want to continually think about that balance of the diet, some protein, some fiber, some healthy carb. Calcium and iron are the two nutrients that tend to be very important in kids. And then choosing more whole foods instead of all the processed foods. So keeping those things in mind. Some of the less healthy foods I listed here, these are things that you want to try to buy less often. If kids aren't seeing this available and in the house and having all of these things in abundance, then they'll be less likely to choose them. These are foods that I would say have a lot of calories, definitely fill up their stomachs and make them not hungry. And so by limiting these foods, it just opens up the door for better nutrient-dense foods. That'll be on the next slide. So limiting sugar and pop and juices, that liquid sugar, like I said, just kind of an empty calorie source. Limit treat foods, fast foods, limit breaded and fried foods, limit the processed foods, and then instead choose more of these foods here. Let's see here. Lean proteins, keep those on hand. Lots of fruits and vegetables on hand. Whole grain carbohydrates, calcium and vitamin D sources, and then also offering iron-rich sources. So I'm going to go into more detail with all of these groups. Here's that balance plate again, just to sort of review where there's, some carbohydrates, some fruits, some veggies, some calcium sources with that milk there, lean protein. That's what a healthy plate looks like. The other thing to keep in mind as I'm looking at this plate too is that if you have young kiddos, they're not going to eat as much as what we might think to put on a plate for ourselves. So sometimes just serving kids a smaller plate may not seem as overwhelming, and they may eat better for you that way as well. Just smaller portions, a couple tablespoons, like I said, depending on the age. So here's a label. So if you look at this label and you're grocery shopping, and getting your kids to help you look at this label for balance can be very helpful and powerful to help you change over your pantry a little bit. But what we're looking for on the label, look down sort of mid-label where it says fiber, and then it also says protein. So usually if there's going to be fiber and protein in your boxed kinds of foods that have a label like this, then usually it's going to be a food that's going to be considered a whole grain or more balanced. So this label right here, for example, has 11 grams of fiber and 13 grams of protein. I'm guessing this is probably a pasta meal or something like that, or probably a pasta meal would be my guess. But it's a balance because there's some protein, some fiber, and there is a little bit of carbohydrate there with 36 grams. So we're getting kids to look at protein and fiber so that they can make healthy choices when it comes to carbohydrate foods. So on the left there I've got written that when you're grocery shopping with your child and maybe they're wanting to pick out a cereal or they're wanting to pick out a snack food, for example, have them look for protein and fiber. And I always tell parents and mentors that if they have 5 grams of protein plus fiber on the label, it's a nice, healthy choice. And it's not really a magic number, but just being a grocery shopper myself, I know that there are enough carbohydrate kinds of snack foods out there that you can find foods here. But keep in mind, too, that there's many snack foods that have zero protein, zero fiber, where if you're looking for nutrient-dense foods, finding foods that have at least 5 grams of protein plus fiber on that label is a good rule of thumb. And then it gets your kids early on thinking about balance instead of thinking about calories and fat and things like that. It's better for kids to grow up thinking about balance. And then I also I've mentioned to my kids growing up that if the product has 4 grams of protein plus fiber, plus something else wonderful like iron or calcium, it has them start looking at some of the nutrients that food can provide too. So this product is providing 24% of iron, which is really a good amount for kids to be able to have in their whole grain, and 4% calcium. So there's a little bit of calcium there too, but really a nice product with all of that iron. So this is a way to grocery shop so that the foods that you're putting in your cart have some nutrition density in them, so that when kids don't eat a lot of something, at least they're getting some good nutrients there. So a little bit more about calcium. Calcium is important, for teeth, bones, and the big thing though here is that a lot of kids, boys and girls, are deficient in calcium. So making sure that we're purchasing those from the grocery store and offering calcium sources. This is an example of calcium needs broken down by age and how many servings then that would be required. So a preteen, for example, or teens age 9 to 18 would need 1,300 milligrams per day, and that translates to about 4 servings of dairy. Then these are some, high calcium sources where each of these sources is about 300 milligrams. So you can kind of do the math there and figure out how to provide that for your child or teen. Vitamin D is important, too, because vitamin D helps calcium absorb. Vitamin D is also really a good nutrient for good mood. And living here in Minnesota, a lot of times we're deficient in this vitamin D because sunshine can be helpful to make our vitamin D usable. So vitamin D sources are listed here, and so pairing this up with a calcium source, a lot of calcium sources are going to have the vitamin D in it. But here's just an example of where you can find vitamin D. Iron, that's that other nutrient that is so important, especially females are at risk, but also teens and boys who are teens are also at risk for an iron deficiency too. Ways that you can find out that iron deficiency might be a possibility. Some symptoms that might show up might be a short attention span, irritability, real tired can be another symptom as well. Doctors can also check for iron deficiencies along with some of the other nutrients. They can do some blood work to see if there are any deficiencies if your kid is really not getting a lot of different nutrition and highly picky eater. These are some iron sources here, and so as you can see, we can think of meats and whole grains and some of these beans and oatmeal, but a lot of your iron, possibly may come from a fortified cereal or a healthy fortified snack food, for example. So that's where, some of these processed foods, healthy processed foods can come in and be helpful to have around for kids. Another important thing for iron would be to take with a vitamin C source because that enhances the absorption of the iron. So a cereal, for example, in the morning or a piece of toast in the morning that has iron in it, alongside that food could be some strawberries, for example. So these are some other vitamin C sources that you could pair up along with iron sources. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about a picky eater versus a dieting issue. The biggest thing with dieting issue versus picky eater is that we want to keep in mind that we're in an environment that really does promote a positive body image. It can be trendy sometimes in school for kids to try out dieting. Sometimes, they're hearing it on social media. Kids are hearing it as they get older, certain TV shows that they're watching or magazines that they're seeing, or even sometimes mom or dad are doing a trendy diet that's out there. So I always tell people to try to use caution with talking about calories or dietary fats with kids. Instead, talk about balance and talk about food affecting them in the way that they feel versus in the way that they look. Trying to use caution with weight or scales, dieting reference or trendy words, trying to limit that kind of talk around kids and getting back to balanced eating. Talking about tummies, I know that sometimes before kids sprout upward in height, sometimes they get a little bit filled out in the midsection, and that's a natural way for a lot of kids as they're waiting to sprout up in height. So just not overreacting about that would be important. Careful what magazines that kids are being exposed to and all the pictures that are all over the media nowadays. And then be careful not to hyper-focus on food and control over food because that can sometimes bring about more problems or more picky eating, more dieting if there's the talk around the house, talk around school is hyper-focused on food. And then model good eating habits in front of the kids and teens as well. So a picky eater or even someone who's dieting, these are just some different symptoms that can come about. Being irritable, tired, less attentive if there's an anemia happening. Depression can be increased if people aren't getting the nutrients that they need, vitamin D, B vitamins. Carbohydrates help with serotonin production or usage, and so if we're limiting too many carbohydrates, depression and anxiety can be an issue. Dehydration can be an issue also, where if people are following diets that are very restrictive, definitely people can be in trouble with dehydration. Ketoacidosis can be a symptom of dehydration or extreme dieting, and that can lead to dizziness, fainting, headache, just confusion, fogginess, nausea, fatigue, sleep problems, and bad breath as well. So some of those things to look out for. Other things down the line that can happen or show up with poor eating or dieting can be slow growth, muscle and bone deterioration, constipation or other GI issues, weakened immune system, dry hair, dull-looking skin, and then in the long run, yo-yo dieting can actually hurt metabolism for later on in life. So instead with kids, when I talk about healthy eating, because sometimes kids who are picky eaters or just, as parents and mentors, we may be a little bit concerned about a weight that might be above target with our kids, and so it's a very delicate subject. And so that's where sometimes bringing in someone else to talk to your child or teen about healthy eating can be more effective than a mom or dad or someone close to talking with kids. Sometimes I'll meet with kids and we'll talk about sports nutrition and we'll definitely talk about balance, but we're not focusing as much on weight. So sometimes an outside person can be a good ally for you. So I always encourage activity first with kids and with parents if they're concerned about a weight that's a little bit higher than desired, because kids are going to grow taller. Kids' weights are going to really start to even out. And so if we can really focus more on being active, not sitting for long amounts of time in front of the TV or on social media or on, the computer, but to get out daily in the sunshine and be moving every day. So limiting kind of those activities where we're sitting for long hours of time. So that's the first place to start. The second thing is to really limit sugar and processed foods, especially pop. Avoid fast food, fried and breaded. Other important bullets would be to encourage breakfast every day. That can really just be helpful for metabolism long term. Being a good role model. Let's see here. Having family goals versus individual goals is very good for kids where as a family, you could say, well, we're all going to try to eat 5 fruits and vegetables each day. And so no one is feeling targeted or extra attention isn't just given to one person. And so that's a good, effective way to do it. Support good sleep habits. That helps kids grow tall if they're sleeping well. It also helps some of those hormones that we have that increase appetite if we're not getting good sleep. You're better able to manage stress hormones that can be related to unhealthy eating choices if you're making sure that you're getting good sleep. Focus on health versus the scale. And then really all of this starts at the grocery store. So some healthy eating strategies are best behind the scenes where you're setting up your kitchen for a really good success. And, kids and teens then kind of need to eat with what you've got on hand there. And so if we're getting rid of, some of the foods that maybe aren't as nutrient dense and we're kind of changing the pantry around so that the carbs on hand have some protein, some fiber, some iron, some calcium, for example, then gradually your child and your family will start to get more nutrient dense foods in their day. So just a review of the overall nutrition goals for kids is that balance piece. Some protein, some fiber, some carbohydrate on hand, at each meal is just going to make them feel better if they have a nice balance on their plate. Limit the sugar, choose fresh over processed, keeping in mind calcium and iron because those are 2 nutrients that are especially important when we think of kids. Healthy weight ideas that we just went over, and then really discouraging any restrictive dieting and do things in the home that can really encourage positive body image so that there's value placed on things besides the way then one looks. So that's what I have for you today. I'd love to take questions if anybody has any questions to send in.
If you came on late, there's a chat feature. You can type in any questions, and Jennifer will answer those. And just while we're waiting, I just want to say thanks to Jennifer. It was very informative. And my question is, it seems like this takes a little load off the parent, thinking about, sometimes you get kind of stressed out thinking about how to feed your kid, but it sounds like if you get things together that it might help in the long run.
Yes, I love that. So that definitely sums up my thought there. And in the beginning, when I listed the comparison between picky eaters and problem eaters, there's a lot of picky eaters out there, and there's a lot of parents that can feel like, oh, I'm so overwhelmed. I want to feed my child right and love my child by feeding them correctly, and there does seem to feel like there's a lot of pressure to make sure that we're, getting our kids to actually swallow the things that we're providing. And when I see parents and kids in the office, a lot of times it's just reassuring them and saying, boy, you're modeling, you're providing good things. Essentially, you're doing all the right things, and it's a lot of times up to the child to decide what they're going to really put in their mouth. So yeah, a lot of times too, kids will grow out of this after a little bit of time. So knowing that can be a little bit helpful too, and yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking too, Donna.
Well, we haven't gotten any questions, so we're going to close out the webinar, and thank you all for joining us. I will send out an email with a link to the recording that we did and to the slides, and I'll include the book that Jennifer referenced as well. So thanks again for joining us. We do have a question here. And I'll turn this back over.
Okay, so the question is, I have a 9-month-old baby, and we are introducing foods to him, and he seems to be a picky eater already. Any tips? Well, I think what comes to my mind is trying to offer some of the less sweet foods first might be helpful for the taste buds, and even just feeling good about, boy, he did have one bite of something that's not as sweet, or something that maybe you wouldn't think he would like or prefer, and then hold off on a sweeter tasting thing until later in the meal. So that's one suggestion I have. And then just offering a variety here and there. And then as time goes on, if the pickiness continues, I think you're just getting started. It's exciting. But if the picky eating continues, I would just talk with a dietitian, or see if there's any major areas of nutrition that are missing. But little by little, more and more exposure is going to be helpful, and probably grow your baby's palate with a little more time. So good luck.
Okay, thank you again for the question, and thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to close out on the webinar. Thanks again.